Hello watch collectors! When choosing the next watch to buy, many of us are deciding between the current generation watches and the previous generation watches. When does it make sense to always get the latest watch? And when would it make sense to consider picking up a watch that is no longer in production? Today I'll share some examples to break down my decision-making process. All the data in this video comes from WatchCharts, the world's leading secondary watch market research platform. Dive into the data yourself at WatchCharts.com. I will be focusing on Rolex watches today, though I would imagine the process will carry over to all the other brands as well. And because we're talking about Rolex watches that are out of production, I will be focusing exclusively on the secondary market prices in this video. We'll be going through some pairs of watches, and I'll be explaining how I will be choosing between each pair so that hopefully the philosophy and the decision-making process will become clear. But ultimately, it comes down to whether or not the upgrades, both in aesthetic changes and movement upgrades, are worth the price premium of the current generation. Let's start with the most iconic dive watch, the Rolex Submariner. First introduced in the 1950s, it has continued to be a standout in the catalog. In 2020, Rolex introduced the current generation stainless steel Submariner date with the black bezel, the reference 126610LN. It currently trades for $13,000 on the secondary market. It replaced the 116610LN, which had been in production since 2010. That watch is trading for $10,400 at the moment, making it $2,600 cheaper, or 20%. So let's take a look at the improvements of the 1.2 generation over the 1.1 generation. The most notable upgrade is in the movement, going from caliber 3135 to caliber 3235. Rolex actually claims that 90% of the components in the new caliber are new. The most practical improvement is in the power reserve, which went up from 48 hours to 70 hours. It also features the new chronology escapement that Rolex has been pushing out over the past decade or so. Compared to the older technology, it is more efficient and more precise. Having said that though, the older 116610 already was very precise, bearing the superlative chronometer certification, which guarantees an accuracy of -2 + 2 seconds per day. The exterior changes are pretty subtle. On paper, the case diameter went up from 40 to 41 millimeters, but because Rolex stopped using the so-called super case that's featured on the 116610, and also because of the slimmer lugs and the wider bracelet on the 126610, the newer one actually looks leaner despite the larger case diameter. Finally, two very minor changes on the current generation are the slightly longer hands and the coronet between the word Swiss and the word made at the bottom of the dial. So in terms of choosing between the two watches, I think if you like a classically proportioned Submariner and or if you care about the longer power reserve, then the current generation 126610 makes more sense. Otherwise, I think there's a pretty strong argument for saving 20% by getting the older reference. The movement was already decent and precise, and the watch isn't even that old, with some examples produced as late as just 5 years ago. By the way, you could actually go a generation further back to the 16610LN. While it's almost $2,000 cheaper than the 116610LN, because it was in production from 1989 to 2010, there would be significant variation in age and condition. To avoid getting to the neo-vintage territory, I will focus on only two generations for this video: the current generation and the generation that preceded it. If you want to consider older references, I invite you to check out our Value for Money Pick series where we delve deeper into each featured collection, including the Submariner. Of course, the analysis mostly carries over to the other references in the Submariner lineup. Here you can see the two generations of the yellow gold Submariner date with the black bezel. The changes are exactly the same as for the stainless steel pair, but the price difference is now $5,400 or 15%. As the percentage gets smaller, the argument for getting the current generation would get stronger. Psychologically though, because the dollar amount difference is higher than the stainless steel counterparts, many people understandably might be tempted to save by getting the previous generation. It's the same thing with the blue bezel yellow gold Submariner dates. The older generation is $5,700 or 16% cheaper. There are, however, some interesting pairs in the Submariner lineup that are worth pointing out. The first is the stainless steel pair with the green bezel. We're comparing the current generation 126610LV, nicknamed the Starbucks, to the previous generation 116610LV, the Hulk. The case and the movement changes are all the same as the black bezel pair, but in this case, there's a very visible aesthetic change. The dial color was changed from green to black. Because of that, the older generation is actually pricier by 20% compared to the current generation. To me, I don't think the green dial alone is worth $6,000. Why $6,000? Because we know from the black bezel pair that the new generation is roughly worth about $2,000 to $3,000 more than the current generation. So that plus the price difference here comes out to be $6,000. In this case, I will make the argument for getting the modern generation black dial and green bezel Submariner, unless, of course, you are dead set on getting a green dial Submariner. Similarly, for the white gold pair, the bezel was changed from the blue dial in the previous generation to the black dial in the current generation. The older generation is 13% pricier than the current generation, which again doesn't feel like worth it to me, given the fact that you're not only paying more, but also giving up on fairly substantial upgrades just to get the dial in blue. Moving on to the Daytona, let's first look at the extremely popular white dial stainless steel Daytona. The current generation reference 126500LN was introduced in 2023 and currently trades for $31,700. The older generation reference 116500LN was in production from 2016 to 2023. That watch now trades for $28,000, which is about $3,700 or 12% cheaper. So what are the differences? First of all, the movement was updated. While the power reserve remained the same at an already impressive 72 hours, you now get the chronology escapement. To be fair, the outgoing 4130 movement already was very advanced, with spring-loaded gear teeth for more precision and no backlash in the gears. There are some notable aesthetic changes. The case diameter is the same, but the case is about a ½ millimeter thinner. On the dial, you have smaller hour markers and thinner subdial rings, which actually make the current generation more similar to the so-called Zenith Daytona because it uses the Zenith movement, which is the reference 16520. This leads to more space on the dial and makes it wear slightly larger than the previous generation. The bezel is still ceramic, but Rolex actually added a steel ring around the outer edge to protect the bezel insert here. All things considered, if you're set on buying a steel Daytona, I think the relatively small price difference makes the current generation a great purchase decision. That is, unless you strongly prefer the aesthetics of the older generation. I personally like the balance on the current generation Daytonas more, but I know many people would disagree. Granted, the movement changes are pretty subtle, but there are still improvements after all. By the way, the comparison is virtually the same for the black dial counterparts of those steel Daytonas. The older generation is about $3,000 or 12% cheaper, and that makes me vote for the current generation again. Also keep in mind that while the older generation isn't even that old, it's still a few years older than the 126500, so the premium can also be justified in that it would be a newer watch. As for the two-tone yellow gold Daytona, the difference is more drastic, both in dollar terms and percentage terms. At 23%, I think the argument for choosing the older generation becomes a lot stronger. And it's the same thing for the fully white gold Daytona. The changes are the same as the steel pair that we reviewed in detail, but the difference is $9,300 or 21%. I would probably go with the previous generation. By the way, for this pair and for the two-tone pair we just looked at, there are many dial variations under each reference number, so what I'm reporting here as the market price is the weighted average of all dials that share the same reference. Of course, you can reasonably expect different dials to have different price points on the secondary market. Another popular sports collection is the GMT-Master. We first look at the blue and black bezel steel models, reference 126710BL and R. It was introduced in 2019 and trades for $16,200. This watch replaced the 116710BL and R, which was in production from 2013 to 2019. That watch trades for $13,700, which is $2,500 or 15% cheaper. What do you get for that $2,500? First, as expected, you get a movement upgrade, which bumps the power reserve up from 48 hours to 70 hours and gives you the new chronology escapement. A very important update is the fact that the current generation is offered on the Jubilee bracelet. In fact, from 2019 to 2021, the Jubilee bracelet was the only option, but since 2021, it can come on the Oyster bracelet as well. In terms of aesthetic changes, the current generation has a more tapered case with thinner lugs, as well as the smaller coronet at the bottom of the dial between the word Swiss and the word made. For this pair, I would say the option to have the Jubilee bracelet on the watch alone makes the update worth it. Even if you buy the watch on the Oyster bracelet, which would be cheaper than if it comes on the Jubilee bracelet, you'll always have the option to change your mind later and swap to the Jubilee bracelet, whereas that's impossible to do on the older generation. We could also look at the white gold GMT Master with the Pepsi bezel and the blue dial. You have the current generation reference 126719 BLRO that was introduced in 2019, which is trading for $36,600. But the previous generation reference 116719 BLRO also features the blue dial and was in production from 2018 to 2019. This trades for $31,700, making it around $5,000 or 13% cheaper than the 1-2 generation. Notably, unlike the Batman pair, both watches only come on the Oyster bracelet. I will probably advocate for saving the $5,000 and going with the older generation. Finally, I want to end on the most transacted collection of Rolex, the Datejust. I will look at the best-selling 41mm steel model with a white gold fluted bezel. There are many dial variations available, and the market prices we talk about here again will be a weighted average of all variations that share this reference number. There's the current generation 126334 introduced in 2016, which is trading for $13,100. The generation prior is the Datejust 2, reference 116334, which was produced from 2009 to 2016. That watch is trading for $9,300, or almost 30% cheaper. In terms of notable changes, the older Datejust 2 had a bulkier look with a thicker bezel, while the current Datejust 41 has a thinner case and a more refined form. The movement was changed from caliber 3136 to the caliber 3235, which increased the power reserve from 48 hours to 70 hours and introduced the chronology escapement. The older Datejust 2 came exclusively on the Oyster bracelet, but the current generation allows for both Oyster and Jubilee bracelets. And of course, you have the coronet between Swiss and Made for this update as well. If you strongly prefer the fluted bezel on the Jubilee, as many people do, then you have to go with the current generation. Otherwise, for around 30% cheaper, the older Datejust 2 reference 116334 is an excellent option since the differences are really only obvious when you put them side by side. In summary, while I hope that the specific comparisons are useful for you as well, the main point I'm trying to convey in this video is really the decision-making philosophy that I'm using while I'm choosing between the current generation watches and the previous generation watches. Ultimately, it comes down to whether or not the price difference can be justified by the movement and aesthetic upgrades. Rolex has long mastered the art of subtly and gradually improving its watches over the years and over the decades, so the idea of considering picking up older and or discontinued models should really be one that's entertained more often. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you go about picking your watches. Is your decision-making process similar to mine? Please let us know down in the comments. Check out our website WatchCharts.com, where you can explore pricing for over 28,000 watches, track market trends, and even monitor your collection's value over time. And if you're looking to buy or sell among value collectors, head over to our marketplace at marketplace.watchcharts.com. Our previous video ranks every Rolex collection by how well they retain their value, so please go check it out if you haven't. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.